Hello and welcome to episode 28 of Alta Asks Live. I'm Beth Spotswood, Alta's digital editor. We've actually just been sitting here discussing a murder, so let me just compose myself and get into professional, non-bloody mode. Alta Asks Live is the digital event series we do at altaonline.com. Today, I'm really excited to talk true crime podcasts with Once Upon a Crime's Esther Ludlow and Alta contributor Denise Hamilton. Denise, whose Alta feature on the 50th anniversary of the Manson murders and the businesses that have sprouted up around that tragedy, recently won an LA Press Club award for that piece. For our latest issue of Alta, which should be right up your alley if you're attending today's event, Denise explored the extraordinary success of the true crime podcast genre with creators like Esther. You can read Death Becomes Them, Denise's story, by clicking the button directly below us. And please use the chat feature or the button feature to ask questions. We're going to talk for about 25 minutes, and then I'm going to grab your questions, and we're going to try and get to as many of them as possible. I can assure you, I am a diehard true crime podcast person, so hopefully I will hit on all of the things that you want to know about, but please do ask those questions. If you're unfamiliar with Alta, we're a quarterly magazine focused on California in the West. That's why so many of the podcasts featured in this story take place or are recorded or produced here in the West Coast. But I also wanted to let you know that we've recently launched the California Book Club, and tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. is our premiere event with author C. Pam Zhang. If you've yet to read Pam's book, don't worry, you can still come to the event. Sign up at californiabookclub.com. There's all the info there. You get a little free gift for signing up. It's lovely. But without further ado, let's talk about Murder Most Foul. Esther and Denise, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Denise, can you tell me just what inspired you to do a story on true crime podcasts? For people who aren't devoted listeners, like I'm a psychopath about it, how did you come to learn about true crime podcasts and their success in the medium?
Well, it's kind of a tangential. I write murder mysteries, and so those are novels. And I was an LA Times reporter for 10 years, so I covered a lot of murders. But I honestly did not know that this world was so huge. And Esther was the first person I interviewed and was so helpful. And of course, then I listened to as many as I could. And I just was astonished. At one point, my editor said, well, exactly how many are there? And, it's hard to tell because I don't think there's a count, but there's like 1 million podcasts out there today, I think, right, Esther? And how many do you think are true crime?
5 million. No, I was kidding. It feels like when I started there was 5, and now it feels like there's 50,000. I don't know, but I know that it seems like every month there's new ones popping up. So there's a lot to choose from. It used to be a lot easier to pick what to listen to. But as you know, true crime podcasts are like potato chips. You can't just have one.
So true.
So I know people that have, dozens of, they subscribe to dozens of true crime podcasts and listen religiously. So
yeah.
Well, what I did to try to count how many there were is I went on one of the platforms, I think it was Apple or iTunes. And I literally I scrolled through them and I counted them off, and they nicely categorized them so that you have like true crime podcasts A to Z, and there were so many columns, and so I think I kind of multiplied it out, and it was at least 10,000.
Right,
and those were like really popular ones.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it's a medium that is both remote because you listen to it from the privacy of your bedroom or your office or your car, if you're an Angelino. And yet it's immediate because I think murder is something that, especially we as women, even though we are less likely to be victims of violent crimes, I think when it happens, we're smaller, we're not as strong as men, we can be overpowered. And so I think it's a real nightmarish fear that anyone who has ever walked out to a car in a dark street or in a parking structure at night after they've been out with friends or out to dinner or whatever, and has their keys in the, to the car, sticking with the keys out. Of course, now we have fobs, so that doesn't work as well. But I think it's something that we all can relate to, that fear. And so the podcast, which is so intimate, the sound in your ear, it feels like someone is telling you an intimate story about a spooky bedtime story.
Well, Esther, you are one of the people who tells me spooky bedtime stories, whether or not you know this. Can you tell us how you came to create Once Upon a Crime?
I've always been a person who was into true crime. Well, I won't say always, but like when I was in high school, I found a book the first book I think it was by Anne Rule, which was The Stranger Beside Me, which is about Ted Bundy.
That book freaked me out.
Yes.
More than any book.
Today, I mean, it still holds up well. It's still one of those books that people who are just getting into true crime will say, yeah, this is, oh my gosh, the best book I've read in true crime. But once I found that, I looked for more. And I really liked not only that at the time, serial killers were something we didn't know much about. Like that was something that was kind of new. Even the terminology, was new, like in the 80s, I think. And so that was interesting, but also the fact that it was the whole story about, who he was and how he came to be, but also about the victims and who they were and how they ended up becoming victims. Just because of, maybe who he was seeking out or that kind of thing. So the whole thing was really fascinating to me, not just the crime part, but also the psychology of like crime and criminals. So that was something I always looked for. And then fast forward, and I became a podcast, listener. And I always thought, man, it'd be great if there was a true crime podcast. That'd be really cool. And I thought, well, I should create one. But I thought, nobody wants to listen to that. So I did find a couple. One was Generation Y. True Murder was the other one, Dan Sabansky's. But there wasn't a whole lot, early 2000s. So I taught myself to podcast just, for fun, I guess. And I thought, but I would love to do a true crime podcast. But then Serial, that launched, and it became a phenomenon. Millions listened to that story, and but it ended after I think 10 episodes. Two things it taught me was, number one, people do like to listen to this kind of content. Like people are very interested in this, maybe even as much as I am. And two, that's going to end, and people are going to be looking for more of this. So at that same time, I was already planning my podcast, and I thought, well, I better get going and launch this. So I launched in 2016. And it was just really, I would be reading this stuff anyway. I would be, learning about these cases anyway. And now I get to tell people about it, about what I've learned. So that's just been, really fun. And then true crime just took off. I think there was My Favorite Murder and Serial and all those things brought that to the forefront for people. And it just became huge. So I was in a good place to turn this actually into my job.
This is your job now.
This is my job, yeah, for the last probably about 3 years, been my full-time job. So
cool.
Yeah, so
she has an assistant.
Yeah,
which means she's really made it in the podcasting world.
How do you, Esther? How do you choose your crimes? I actually included a link to your website in the latest, The Ghosts in the Attic, which is, it's about a guy in the attic. It's terrifying, but wonderful. You should totally listen to it, and Esther will weave her way into your head. But how do you choose which crime to research, and how long does it take you to kind of put together all your research, write the script? What's your process like?
So a couple of, number one is because I pick a topic every month. So I usually, think of a type of crime or some kind of scenario that a crime would fit into. And then I look for cases that fit into that topic. Usually I start with one that I know I want to do, and then I say, okay, what other ones would kind of fit into this topic? So that helps me to find a whole bunch of different cases to research. And then of course some may have enough information for me to tell the whole story. Some may not. So that's how I kind of weed them out. But there's got to be a couple. It doesn't matter if it's one that people know well or they don't know at all. Either one could be a candidate. But I don't want it to be super cut and dry. Like, this happened, they got caught, the end. There really has to be some kind of a human story factor, twist, something that's really going to be a hook. Because I think like a reader. I'm a big reader. So I'm thinking, what would make me keep reading this story? And because unfortunately, there's a crime for everything. There's lots and lots of crime out there. But I want to be able to tell it in a way where I can give the whole picture of it. So as far as the process, I figure out what it is. I start looking for information, start doing the research on it. My assistant Lorena, she helps me to find sources and put together like an outline for it. And then I just write. Luckily for me, I write really fast. I don't do a lot of editing because I'm writing for spoken word. So I'm not about, when I read through it, if it sounds weird, then I'll change that sentence or that paragraph or whatever. But writing is a whole nother craft that I don't necessarily say that that's what I do. I feel like I'm more of a storyteller because it's more of an audio. So I try to do it in a way that makes it interesting to listen to and remember that people are listening and you don't want to get lost in the details. So I try to be careful with that. But I mean, I wish I can say, oh yeah, I spent a month writing no, it's like 3 days. Like, but,
that's impressive. Well, Denise, a writer, when you were working on this, there are a couple of things that I want to touch on just with this piece. One of them, Esther alluded to, giving credit. And we were talking about, there's a podcast called Crime Junkie that is wildly popular. And I know you had it didn't make it into the article, but you did a little bit of research on how they kind of got into some trouble with using work, other people's research, other people's words. Did you discover kind of an ethics around true crime podcasting specifically? And how does that relate to, is it different than journalism as you and I would think of it?
Well, I think in journalism, you're supposed to give credit. And if somebody else broke the story at another magazine or newspaper, then it would be nice to give credit, but people don't always do that. And often it's the big companies, the big newspapers who are bigfooting over the little guy who broke the story. And so I'm kind of seeing the same thing in the podcast true crime world, whereby a small independent podcaster such as you, Esther, who doesn't have deep pockets, who doesn't have a staff, lawyers, people vetting your stuff, or people that you can sick on people who copy you. And if somebody rips off part or most of your script and of your story, you're kind of stuck, because if they have deep pockets, you would have to file a lawsuit and you have to hire a lawyer. And how are you going to do that? So I think that once the big money started coming into podcasting, and true crime podcasting is a part of that, and all these companies sprang up somewhere around when, like 2016, 17, 18, some of them even later, all of a sudden these media companies woke up and said, whoa, this is like huge and we want a piece of it. So they could hire celebrities, professional journalists to do research. And, they had their own, sometimes it was a vertically integrated company. So they were allowed to use music that was copyrighted because maybe they just paid somebody a little money. You can't do that, right, Esther? Yeah, because it's copyright.
Yeah.
So I think that, it's very easy if a podcaster wants to cut corners or is on deadline and is under pressure, to have a little ethical lapse and say, oh, I think I'll just, take most of the words or many of the words from this other person's podcast, and maybe he or she won't notice, and I'll kind of spin it into my own. So I think there's there's a murky gray area, but I think that, what you did, Esther, was also show, like, paragraph by paragraph, how the other podcast kind of copied what you did and did it after you. So clearly they were not the originators of it.
Right.
Clearly, because of, as Denise, you mentioned, the big money that has become involved in podcasting and thus true crime podcasting. Esther and Denise, can you talk a little bit about how is it? It seems like it is both very competitive as well as kind of a quirky and loving community of true crime podcasters, with events like Crime Con, the next year to be international crime convention. And I know you have meetups. I know you've co-hosted meetups with other popular true crime podcasters. Can you talk a little bit about competition versus community?
Yeah, the funny thing is, it's like, talking about money, at first there was no money. Okay. And this is when it's the most fun, right? It's like everybody's just there to create. They want to create, they want to put something out there for listeners and they enjoy doing it. And that's when it's really, really fun. And that is still the majority of the people that I know that are in true crime podcasting. I mean, just amazing, very hardworking, very creative, that have a unique way of doing a true crime podcast. So from the get-go, I've had a lot of encouragement and support, and we do that for each other. And we just, meet each other either online, and then we look forward to meeting each other like meetups or crime cons or, those kind of things. But yeah, we do definitely have this little community. I think there's a few outliers out there that are so big that they, I guess, maybe don't really need that or really seek that out. But for the most part, we're still all indie podcasters, and so we do seek that out. We do want to help each other out and encourage one another, because we will do, promotion, have them on our shows or do promos for other true crime podcasts, because people are always looking for more content and we can't put out fast enough what people are looking for. So we definitely say, oh, if you love my show, you should go listen to this one. Or, my friends she just did this amazing series on this story or this episode. So yeah, it's really, really fun. And I think that it's kind of like, this is kind of like our class, like our class reunions and things when we get together. Of course, this year we didn't get together, but so we all kind of missed that. But, we're really looking forward to hopefully everything going back to normal next year. We can see each other again. Like you said, Crime Con is going to be in Austin next year. And we also have a first Crime Con UK in London, a week after the Austin one. So some of us are going to both of those, which is going to be amazing. I can't wait. And I just keep my fingers and toes crossed that that we all get to fly and travel and do all those things again.
Do you have to call dibs on a crime? Oh, sorry. Do you have to call dibs on a crime if you want to do, does someone say, I call, the guy in the attic?
No. As a matter of fact, it really is. It's happened where it's like, oh my gosh, I'm just getting ready to publish this, and somebody I know just put out did that same case. But the thing is listeners always say, well, I want to hear your take on it, so I'm going to listen to both. And I do. I won't listen to somebody who's already done that case until after I'm done and it's published. And then I'll go and listen to theirs and see, oh, well, they did it this way, or, oh, I didn't know that thing, or, oh, this part I added and they didn't put that part in, or whatever. So yeah, people don't mind it. We don't mind it at all. It's not at all competitive in that way.
Right, Denise.
Well, I came to this story as a crime novelist, and I see a lot of parallels between my world and Esther's world. And that is that when you're in genre, whether it's romance or sci-fi or true crime or made-up mystery crime, the readers and the listeners are voracious, and they will just gobble down story after story. And if you write a series, they will zip through the series in a week and say, okay, well, when is your next book coming out? And so there's a camaraderie among the mystery crime writers that I also see in the indie true crime podcasting world, where it's like, we have a lot of the same readers and listeners, but there's plenty to go around. And, we the crime writers are also like, oh, well, if you like my work, why don't you read so-and-so? And it's really nice because there is a camaraderie and there is a feeling of we're all in this together. Whereas, maybe with literary fiction, maybe you're going to read 2 literary fiction novels, a year, I don't know. But with mysteries, people gobble them down like chocolates. And I think that's what we see in the podcast world too. And when I was interviewing people were really helpful. Like, Esther, I said to you, well, I'm trying to focus on California and West Coast podcasters. And you were like, oh, well, have you talked to so-and-so? Have you talked to so-and-so? And there was like a generosity of spirit there, which I really appreciated and also recognized from, the mystery fiction world. So it was lovely.
Do you think that kind of camaraderie is because there's something a little bit quirky about those of us that are into crime and murder, whether it's fictional or real, that, like speaks to like that, oh, you're a little bit weird too. Let's be friends.
I can speak to that as far as remembering the first year of CrimeCon. Because again, I think I had talked about this when I was going to start my podcast. I thought, I don't know that anybody's going to want to listen to these stories. I mean, it's pretty dark. I mean, who wants to spend their day listening to murder, besides me? And so, I mean, I had, like my sister, like I knew she would, but I didn't know if there was going to be a lot of people. So then when I started doing the podcast and I had so many listeners, I thought, okay, they're out there. So CrimeCon was the place where everybody converged and you could see, I mean, and you can ask anybody who goes to CrimeCon, which I have to say it's like probably 89% women. But
that's question.
Yeah. So, but it was like people making their best friends there. Like they would, a lot of people came alone and said, because I don't know anybody who would come to me with me to this thing, but they would go and they just meet, a whole group of new friends, and now they're friends for life. And it's like, yeah, you find your people. So yeah, there's a little bit of that for sure. And people are but it's in a fun way. It's not in a weird, like, okay, we're both weird. I mean that there is that, but I think that's one of my favorite murder sayings, right? About being weird or something. So yeah, so there is that part where we kind of own that kind of weirdness or that strange fascination with crime. And I'm sure it's the same with your readers, same kind of thing.
Well, I think as podcasters and as novelists, we operate alone. We sit in a room and we create stuff. And so going out to cons is fun because it's like being at the prom or being at a party and you meet all these people that perhaps you never met before. Like you were saying, you just, you recognize the voices of, oh, it's that podcaster or that, there she is in person. I've only ever heard her whispering into my ear. And so, yeah, it's nice. It feels good to find a like-minded community of people who share this interest, even though it's a bit of an oddball interest. But it's apparently very, very popular. We are not alone, right?
I wanted to talk a little, we're getting some questions about it. And before we run out of time, I definitely want to make sure we talk about women and crime. Why? And I want to hear from both of you on this. Why? What is the attraction between women specifically and crime, whether it be fictional or true?
I think there's as many answers to that as times I've been asked that question. But I'll touch on just a couple of them. One of them, for me anyway, it's because it's not just, and I talk about kind of the Law and Order type of, way of coming at true crime. It's like, okay, here's the crime, here's the investigation, and here's the outcome, the trial or whatever, the conviction. It's more about, for me, it's more about all of the human factor of it and also the psychology of crime and motivation. And I think women tend to be much more interested in picking that apart. Like, who is this person? Why does somebody do something like that? And who could, I want to know about their background. Like, how did they end up becoming a serial killer or whatever? It's not just what they do, but it's why they do it, at least for me. And I find that with a lot of my listeners, that is definitely their interest, because those are the kind of things that I'm so interested in to find out. And I try to bring that side of the story to the episodes that I do. So that's one of them. But there's a lot of reasons, I think.
Well, I'll talk about another one. Well, first of all, I think that people are innately interested in, checking out the car crash on the freeway that's happening on the other side, and you're not supposed to look. You're supposed to keep driving, but you just, it's carnage, and you just want to see what it looks like. So I think there's a human interest in murder and violence, if only to figure out, I think as women, how to avoid it. And there's this problem-solving aspect to it as a woman, which is like, okay, what were the steps that I could have taken differently? And what if I didn't, if this happened to me, I shouldn't get in that car, or I shouldn't have trusted that guy, or I should have gotten out of that relationship. I should have just, gone to a shelter immediately, or whatever. And so I think that psychologically, both with true crime novels and murder mysteries and true crime podcasts, as a woman, you kind of pit your own skills against what's being told to you. Like, okay, who did it? There's usually suspects, right? Many suspects. Was it the ex-husband? Was it a cop? Was it a true stranger? Was it somebody who crossed the victim in business? And so I think what we want to do is figure out what were the steps that led to that murder, and how could we learn from that so that we can avoid that in our real lives, even though hopefully we'll never run into that situation.
Well, that was what's so, I think what appeals to people about your intro to true crime, A Stranger Beside Me, was that Ann Rule worked next to Ted Bundy, who was very charming and good looking, and people got into his VW bug no problem because he was charming and good looking. And so I agree, Denise, that it really kind of teaches us, oh, geez, don't get in the hot guy's car. He could be Ted Bundy.
Well, also, I just want to say with Ann Rule is I read an interview with her where she said she was a homicide detective, I think, in Kings County in outside of Seattle or Washington somewhere. And she said, if I was a cop and I didn't pick up on the fact that he was a serial killer, then what possibility could these poor college co-eds have had? And she said, I wrote that book to investigate how I was taken in, and just to explore even not just his psychology and that of the victims, but of her. How was she rooked by him? Someone who really should have known better. So it's human frailty, nature, whatever.
We have time for 2 more questions. The first is, do you think, it comes from Ruth, I think, is there a need for more diversity in the types of crimes that are covered, either by podcasts or by true crime writers?
I do see that happening a lot more, and because we're getting more podcasters coming in, and a lot of them are deciding to focus on one either type of victim, population, cases that aren't being covered in the mainstream media, that kind of thing. So there definitely is more of that. But yeah, one of the things that podcasts, people that are listening to podcasts, feel free to suggest cases, because of course we can't hear about them all. And if you know of one, especially if you think it fits with a certain kind of podcast, feel free to. Usually most podcasters will take those suggestions and say, look, do some research on it and see if they can get enough to do an episode on. So yeah, if you know of those, definitely, because again, if they're not in the news, we're not hearing about them either. We do as much research as we can, but we don't necessarily know if it's one of those that hasn't been, we can't get a lot of information on. So yeah.
The beauty of podcasting is that you can do it with a laptop and a built-in microphone, right? So there's no barriers to entry by race or class or anything else, I don't think, as long as you have Wi-Fi. So in terms, but I do see a lot more diversity in podcasting today. And I interviewed a diverse number of people. And I was really happy that almost everybody I interviewed was a woman. That was interesting because I don't think there were all that many women. But it just turned out that a lot of the true crime podcasters in California are women. And yes, there's this whole like dead white girl syndrome in the mainstream media that the dead white girl from a, upper middle class family in the suburbs is going to get a lot more ink than someone who's not in that category. And it's something that when I was a journalist, I always fought against. I just found it much more interesting to focus on not the usual suspects. And but I think there's more awareness today. Mm-hmm. And I did see that on some of the podcasts at the end, the podcasters will say, if you have an idea for a crime that we should write about, let us know. And so I really like what you said about that, Esther, that it's kind of a two-way street in terms of what stories you're going to write next.
This is a great segue into our last question. A podcast that I would love to recommend to everyone is Finding Cleo, which is by the CBC. And it is about the search for the kind of what happened to an Indigenous young teen who was eventually murdered. She's from Canada, but when she came to America, she was murdered. And it's a fascinating and kind of heartbreaking series, a serial style podcast. So with that, could each of you recommend, putting aside Once Upon a Crime, your favorite, pick a maximum of 3 true crime podcasts that we should be listening to?
So many. For diversity, I'll give you a couple, and then one of my very favorite, because I have to give them props because they got me into podcasting really. For diversity, I would say The Fall Line. If you guys haven't tried it, The Fall Line, Laura and Brooke do an amazing job of. They're based in Georgia, and they do a lot of cases of missing and murdered people who didn't get any attention. Most African American. Women and some men as well, and affirmative murder, two African American young guys from Baltimore who are hilarious and focus on crimes that either the perpetrator, usually the perpetrator is African American or sometimes the victim, but they do a great job of finding cases that I haven't heard about. And the Generation Y, if you're looking for something that you will never run out of episodes to listen to, and they do a lot of kind of mysteries or maybe possible wrongful conviction. So there's always a twist. It's not usually a straightforward crime, and it's 2 guys and they do a discussion, but it's very based on fact. So it's not a lot of chit chat. They really get into the story and then may give their theories at the end. So that's the Generation Y, and they're my buds. They're the ones that got me on the map because they mentioned Once Upon a Crime when I just launched on their show, and they've been around since, I don't even know how long. One of the first true crime podcasts out there. So they do a great job too.
Denise,
I was just amazed because I just thought that the true crime podcasts were pretty much like Esther's, kind of fairly straightforward. I didn't realize there were comedy murder podcasts and, Murder and Wine and, white collar crime. And anything you can imagine. What interests me, I guess, as a fiction writer is when the crime is not solved. There's no end to it. And so podcasts like The Vanished by Marissa Jones, those are people who vanished off the face of the earth. And I didn't interview her because she's not based on the West Coast, but her podcast is so empathetic, and she really does a lot of research, and she tries to interview people all around the victim, cops, family, friends, because she needs with a cross section like that, you get very different perspectives. And, I guess I keep hoping that with her podcast that someone will listen to it and say, okay, I know who did it, and I'm going to go to the police, or I'm going to email Marissa and tell them that she should investigate, look at the ex-boyfriend or the neighbor who moved away or whatever. So those, to me, the fact that they are not solved are haunting. They don't provide closure, though, so maybe that's not what some people want. And then the other type of podcast that I like are the ones where the crimes are in different places around the world. Because much like I like reading murder mysteries that are set in, Sweden or South America or, Alaska, places that I don't know that well, I appreciate podcasts that where the crime is in a locale that I'm probably not all that familiar with. And let me tell you, I did not realize how many people go missing and are murdered in Canada. Our friendly northern neighbor. All those, open rolling fields and prairies. And yes, the Canadians are lovely, but there's some bad stuff going down on those open prairies as well. So,
as Ruth just pointed out, she's in Australia and there are heaps down there. Case file, Ruth. Are you a case file person? Because
it seems like.
Well, that's the beauty of podcasts is you can be anywhere and have listeners and listen. And, just get plunged into a whole different culture. And, books are that way too. You topple into this world. And I think that's what, the best podcasts do as well. So it's all good.
When you're listening, though, just keep one earbud in because you need to be listening to who's behind.
Oh, right. I know.
I
turn my alarm on. I do it with my alarm on. Guys, we went 9 minutes over. Thank you to everyone for sticking with us. A big thank you to Esther and Denise for joining us today. Thanks to everyone who came. If you're into this, you might be into our guest next week. Judith Freeman is going to be in conversation.
Oh.
Yeah, I knew you'd like this, Denise.
I love her.
And she's going to talk about Raymond Chandler, noir author Raymond Chandler and his femme fatales. She'll be in conversation with Alta Books editor David Yulin, Wednesday, 12:30, October 21st, right here at Crowdcast. This conversation will be up on altaonline.com this afternoon, as soon as I can download it and re-upload it again. And again, a big thank you to Esther and Denise. Same to you. Thank you guys so much. And everyone stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.